In the quiet town of Riverview, the brutal murder of Hannah Miller, a hard-working single mother, shattered the community's peace. At the center of it all was her 14-year-old son, Daniel Miller, the only witness, and soon the prime suspect. Neighbors like Mrs. Carter, who lived 2 doors down, recalled seeing Daniel acting strangely that night, while Hannah's friends, such as Linda Hayes, painted a picture of a woman struggling with her son's temper behind closed doors. Teachers like Mr. Collins described Daniel as a quiet boy, with sudden bursts of anger, while investigators, led by Detective Mark Reynolds, followed every clue with growing unease. Evidence pointed one way, but Daniel's age and a powerful defense attorney, Richard Clark, pushed the jury toward mercy. What emerged was not just a case of murder, but a haunting story of how a boy accused of killing his own mother walked away free. The town of Riverview was the kind of place where people rarely locked their doors, and neighbors waved at each other from across the street. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the sort of place where everyone knew the names of the children who played in the parks and the families who lived in each house. That is why the discovery one hot summer morning would not only shock the town but permanently stain its reputation for safety. Hannah Miller was found dead in her own bedroom, and the violence of the crime suggested something far more disturbing than a random act. The police were called after a neighbor noticed Daniel, Hannah's 14-year-old son, outside the house screaming for help. Officers arrived quickly, but the scene inside was already beyond saving. Hannah's body lay on the floor near her bed, with bruises and wounds that made it clear she had fought back. Furniture was overturned, a lamp shattered, and sheets pulled onto the ground as though a desperate struggle had taken place. Investigators noted that the front door was unlocked and nothing appeared to have been stolen. It was not a robbery gone wrong. Something more personal had happened within those walls. The initial shock spread through Riverview like wildfire. Hannah had been well-liked and was described as a gentle soul, who always smiled at neighbors and offered to babysit children when someone needed help. She worked long shifts at the local diner and still managed to attend school events for her son. People found it impossible to imagine who could have wanted to hurt her. She was one of those people who, in the eyes of the community, seemed untouched by the darker side of life. Yet now she had become the victim of a savage crime. Attention immediately turned to the only other person known to be inside the house that night, Daniel. At just 14 years old, he looked more like a child than a suspect. He was trembling, pale, and tearful when police tried to ask him questions. He told them he had been asleep in his room, only waking when he heard noises that sounded like a fight. By the time he got up, he said, he found his mother on the floor in the room in chaos. His cries for help drew the attention of neighbors, which was why they were the first to call emergency services. His story seemed simple and believable at first. The town quickly embraced Daniel as the surviving victim of a nightmare. People dropped off food at the house and spoke about how terrible it must be for him to lose the only parent he had. For detectives, though, the case was more complicated. There was no sign of forced entry, no missing valuables, and no clear suspect. Every lead they had seemed to circle back to the boy, yet the idea of accusing him was unthinkable to many. Still, deep down, whispers began to spread. Was Daniel truly just a witness, or could he have been something much darker? Daniel's account of the night of the murder was, at first glance, difficult to challenge. He insisted that he had gone to bed early because his mother had been working late, and he was tired from summer activities. He described waking up to a sound he thought was a crash, running to his mother's room and discovering her lying motionless. His panic, he said, led him to shout for help outside the house until neighbors noticed. By the time police arrived, he was crying and visibly shaken, his shirt wrinkled and his voice trembling. To investigators, his behavior seemed consistent with trauma, yet small details of his story left them uneasy. Forensic teams combed through the Miller house with meticulous care. They dusted for fingerprints, photographed the scene, and bagged every object that might carry clues. What they found was troubling. The majority of fingerprints belonged either to Hannah or Daniel. A few smudged prints were discovered on the windowsill and doorknobs, but none were clear enough to identify. No broken locks, no shattered glass, no forced entry of any kind appeared anywhere in the house. Whoever had committed this crime had either been let inside willingly or had already been there before the attack began. This raised questions no one wanted to answer. Investigators asked Daniel about visitors, but he gave vague responses. He claimed his mother did not have many friends over, and rarely dated. He did not mention anyone who might have stayed late that night. Detectives pressed him about whether he had seen anyone unusual in the neighborhood, but his answers stayed short. They could not shake the feeling that he was withholding something, though it was unclear whether it was intentional or simply the confusion of a teenager in shock. Neighbors were interviewed next. Most recalled seeing Daniel outside when emergency services arrived, waving his arms and calling for help. Several said they had never seen such genuine panic on a child's face. This seemed to support his version of events. Yet others noted that the noise of a struggle should have been louder, more noticeable, especially in the quiet summer night when windows were open. Only one neighbor had reported faint thuds and voices, but she admitted she had not paid close attention until the sirens filled the street. That uncertainty left investigators with little to rely on. The town, meanwhile, refused to consider Daniel as a suspect. People brought casseroles, blankets, and words of comfort, treating him as a boy robbed of everything. His youth made it easy to see him as innocent, almost fragile. The police, however, could not dismiss the strange inconsistencies in his story. If Hannah had been attacked by a stranger, why were there no signs of entry? If Daniel had been asleep, how had he heard so little of the struggle that left the room in ruins? Each unanswered question deepened the mystery. Though detectives had suspicions, they lacked evidence strong enough to pursue charges. Daniel's alibi held, supported by neighbors who swore they saw him outside after the fact. For now, the investigation stalled, and a boy who might have known more than he admitted remained free, wrapped in the sympathy of a grieving community. As the investigation dragged on with no arrests, detectives turned their focus away from the crime scene and toward the lives of those most closely involved. Hannah Miller's past revealed nothing unusual. No history of criminal connections, no disputes that seemed violent, and no secret relationships that could have explained her death. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that her world revolved around her son. Daniel had always been the center of her life, and she worked exhausting hours at the diner just to keep their small home running. On the surface, it painted the image of a hard-working mother and her child. But when investigators began speaking with people who knew Daniel, a very different picture began to emerge. At school, Daniel was remembered as quiet, often sitting at the back of the classroom with his head down. Teachers described him as intelligent but unwilling to apply himself, drifting between assignments without much care. While he rarely caused problems during class, several noted moments when his temper would flare unexpectedly. One teacher recalled how he once slammed his books onto the floor after being corrected, his face red with anger before quickly shutting down and going silent again. Classmates added to the story, describing how he sometimes bullied younger students when no one was watching, yet managed to appear harmless when adults were near. It was a split personality that unsettled those who had been close enough to notice it. Social workers who had once visited the Miller household provided more context. Hannah, they said, had reached out in the past for advice when Daniel's behavior became difficult to control. She described nights when he would scream at her, throwing objects across the room, followed by hours of silence where he refused to speak. Reports noted he seemed to struggle with anger, but that Hannah always insisted he was a good boy at heart. She believed he was simply adjusting to the pressures of adolescence without a father figure in his life. The case files were eventually closed with no ongoing concerns, but in light of her death, those old details began to feel more important. The community, however, was not ready to accept this darker version of Daniel. To neighbors, he was still the boy who played basketball in the driveway, shyly waved at them, and helped his mother carry groceries. But underneath, investigators saw signs of a troubled young man capable of far more than people believed. The inconsistencies in his behavior grew more suspicious the closer they looked. For instance, friends of the family remembered Hannah once confiding that Daniel had scared her when he lost his temper, and that she worried about leaving him home alone for too long. The more detectives pieced together, the more they began to wonder if the answers to Hannah's murder had been inside her own house all along. Yet suspicion was not the same as proof. Without direct evidence, all they had were troubling stories and unanswered questions. Daniel's mask of grief remained firmly in place, protecting him from the truth that seemed to be slowly surfacing. Just as investigators were running out of leads, a quiet knock on the police station door shifted everything. It was a neighbor from Maple Street, a middle-aged woman who lived 2 houses down from the Millers. She had been reluctant to speak earlier, fearing she might have misinterpreted what she saw, but the weight of her memory finally forced her forward. On the night Hannah was killed, she recalled waking up around midnight to use the bathroom. Through her window, she noticed movement in the Miller backyard. Squinting, she saw Daniel, alone, carrying what looked like a heavy object wrapped in cloth. He appeared nervous, glancing around before disappearing behind the shed. At the time, she assumed it was nothing. Perhaps a boy sneaking out late with something trivial, but after hearing the details of the murder, the memory gnawed at her. Investigators listened carefully and decided to act on the tip. The Miller property was searched again, this time with a focus on the yard. Behind the shed, buried beneath a layer of soil and leaves, they uncovered a bundle wrapped in a torn bedsheet. Inside was a hammer, its handle stained and its head crusted with something unmistakable. It was sent to the lab, and the results left no room for doubt. The blood on the hammer matched Hannah Miller's. Even more damning, fingerprints on the handle belonged to Daniel. The discovery was explosive. The hammer explained the blunt force injuries documented in the autopsy, and the attempt to bury it suggested clear intent to hide evidence. The quiet suspicion that had lingered now solidified into something stronger. Detectives, however, knew they were entering fragile territory. Daniel was only 14, charging a child with the murder of his own mother was a step that required not only evidence, but the willingness of the justice system to pursue. The town's reaction was immediate and divided. Some refused to believe it, arguing that the boy must have handled the hammer at some earlier time and that someone else could have used it. Others began whispering that they had always suspected something about him, recalling his sudden mood swings and distant behavior. The image of an innocent child shattered under the weight of the evidence, but disbelief lingered. In interrogation, Daniel's lawyers pushed the idea that the hammer, while stained, could not conclusively prove intent. After all, fingerprints could be left on any object in the home, and he lived there. But investigators countered with the neighbor's testimony, describing how he had been seen burying the object. That detail made the case harder to dismiss. For detectives, this was the turning point. They finally had something tangible, something they could bring into court. Yet even with the hammer in hand, the path ahead was uncertain. Legal battles loomed, and the question of whether Daniel would face trial as an adult or remain under the shield of his age was already dividing opinions. The evidence was strong, but the system itself might still allow him to walk away. The courtroom was packed when Daniel's trial began, the air heavy with tension as the small town gathered to watch the boy at the center of its darkest mystery. Prosecutors laid out the evidence carefully. The hammer buried in the yard, stained with Hannah's blood and marked with Daniel's fingerprints. The neighbor's account of seeing him sneak out that night, the absence of forced entry, the history of his violent temper. Piece by piece, they painted a picture of a son who had turned on his mother in a fit of rage, then tried to conceal his crime. They argued that this was no accident but a deliberate act of violence. The defense countered just as fiercely. They leaned on Daniel's age, portraying him as a child still learning right from wrong. They argued that the hammer could have been used by anyone, and that fingerprints alone could not prove he had wielded it in the fatal attack. They questioned the reliability of the neighbor's memory, suggesting she had only convinced herself of what she saw after hearing about the murder. Most of all, they appealed to the jury's emotions, reminding them that convicting a 14-year-old boy of murder was a decision that would scar him for life. Day after day, testimony unfolded. Teachers described Daniel's quiet, strange behavior, but others remembered him as polite. Social workers spoke of Hannah's struggles with her son's temper, but neighbors recalled a boy who still helped carry groceries. Each side clashed, leaving the jury caught between two conflicting versions of reality. Some jurors were deeply unsettled by the evidence, while others hesitated, unwilling to believe a child could commit such brutality. The prosecution's strongest moment came when forensic experts confirmed the hammer's stains matched Hannah's DNA, and the prints matched Daniel. Yet the defense dismantled the impact, pointing out that the hammer was a household tool Daniel could have touched countless times before, and that no one had witnessed the actual act of violence. Without a confession, they argued, the case remained circumstantial. When closing arguments finished, the jury withdrew, leaving the town in agonizing suspense. Hours stretched into a day before they returned with their decision. The verdict shocked everyone, not guilty. Daniel was acquitted on grounds of reasonable doubt. Gasps filled the room, and Hannah's friends wept openly. Some jurors later admitted they believed he was guilty, but could not bring themselves to convict a boy so young without absolute certainty. Daniel was released, and the case went cold. He left Riverview soon after, vanishing into another life, leaving behind only whispers. Some said justice had failed. Others wondered if the jury had been right, if perhaps the truth was more complicated than anyone would ever know. But suspicion never left him, and Riverview would always remember him as the boy tied to the most brutal crime it had ever seen. The legend of Hannah Miller's murder endured, and so did the chilling title Daniel carried with him forever: the boy who got away with murder.